Good evening, everybody. Welcome. My name is Shari De Silva, and I'm delighted to introduce today's talk to you. Um, Before doing so, I'll speak very briefly about the program, which actually takes us back to 2023, where on the occasion of Bawa's beloved garden, Nunuganga, we embarked on 2 years of programs of exhibitions, events, and talks. And I think many of you have joined us at that time. And as part of that program, we reached out to two institutions that were also grappling with the varied conceptual and practical implications of a garden museum and a living collection. On Gardens, as this project was called, was a Geoffrey Bawa Trust initiated collaboration with the Instituto Burle Marx in Brazil and the Noguchi Museum in the USA, and where we hoped that a series of exchanges, including a public presentation, would allow us to unpack this idea of a garden and use that as a lens for understanding the work of Roberto Burle Marx, Isamu Noguchi, and Geoffrey Bawa. So in 2023, Isabella Ono, the director of the Instituto Burle Marx, spoke about the work of the Brazilian landscape designer. And you can find a recording of that talk on our YouTube channel. Unfortunately, a succession of structural changes at the Noguchi Museum meant that we were unable to bring Dakin Hart, who initially worked with me on that project. But as he and I reflected on the transnational, transdisciplinary work of Noguchi, which was an affinity that he shared with Burle Marx and Bawa, we thought, of course, of M+, which has a key collection of Noguchi's works and also works within this framework of questioning the boundaries and labels that frame the discourse around visual culture. And I think this is particularly salient because Asia was very important to Noguchi, who was of Japanese and American heritage and spent long stints working in Japan and China. And these were very influential to his practice. Like Bawa, Noguchi traveled widely, including to Sri Lanka in 1949, and the Noguchi Archives holds photos and letters from that trip. More importantly, he made a sculpture in stone much later in 1970, which was called Sigiriya. And while someday we would love to install that work in Sri Lanka, which was part of the original plan, I've just been told that they are installing it on view in New York, which seems like some very lovely serendipitous timing. So we are very grateful to be able to return to this topic now with Doryun Chong to wrap up the On Gardens project, which I should also mention was supported by a grant from the Graham Foundation in Chicago. What Dorian and his team at M+, including Iko Yokoyama, who is also here today, has done is perfect in terms of reflecting on the influence and impact of artists like Noguchi, like Bawa. And I think a lot of these endings are often also beginnings. And in 2027, M+ will present an exhibition on Bawa, which the Trust is working with them and with the Vitro Design Museum. So, as many of you who are here today probably already know, Doryun Chong is the artistic director and chief curator of M+, the Museum for Visual Culture in Hong Kong. He oversees all curatorial activities and programs at M+, across the museum's three main disciplinary areas of design and architecture, moving image, and visual art. Dorian has curated and overseen critically acclaimed exhibitions for M+, including Noguchi Fayan Vo, Counterpoint, Yayoi Kusama, 1945 to now, and Picasso for Asia, A Conversation. He has also helped organize and supervise the 5 editions of Hong Kong's participation in the Venice Biennale from 2015 to 2024. Prior to joining M+, Dorian worked at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, and the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco. Once again, thank you, Dorian, for accepting our invitation. And before I hand over to you, I'm just going to remind the audience that we will follow the talk with questions and answers over time for some discourse. So please think up of what you would like to add. And please join me now in welcoming Dorian.
Is that okay? Okay, great. Thank you so much, Sherry, for that very kind introduction. And thank you, Geoffrey Bawa Trust, for the very warm invitation and kind welcome that I have received. I've been here about 20 hours. I've been browbeated for many, many years for not making the time to come to Colombo, to Sri Lanka, because of course M Plus has a few colleagues who have very deep connection with Bawa and with Sri Lanka. So I'm delighted that I finally, made my way here. And especially to talk about Isamu Noguchi, who of course is a very important figure for my institution. And I think I can say maybe for myself as a curator, but I certainly cannot profess to be an expert in Noguchi, but maybe a little bit. And through really, all the learnings that I had from taking heart that were shared with his esteemed colleague who was a longtime senior curator at the Noguchi Museum, and he really played such an instrumental role. And it's so nice to hear that that was also resonant for the Bawa Trust as well. So anyway, without much further ado, let's start. So you've been looking at this archival photo, and then this is a photo of, excuse me, Isamu Noguchi with somebody named Mirei Shigemori, who is a very, very important landscape designer, almost a legendary figure from the early to mid 20th century. And then they are in Shikoku Island, Tokushima in Shikoku, examining stones for the UNESCO garden in Paris. So this is dated 1957. So I will come back to this in the middle of my presentation. But before I get there, before I start talking about gardens and the importance of landscape architecture in Noguchi's work, arguably what Isamu Noguchi is best known for is perhaps stone sculptures, right? So I'm just showing you some examples going back to 1958, and then this great one called Great Rock of Inner Seeking, 1974, in the collection of the National Gallery of Art in DC. And then these examples from the 1980s using some of his favorite stones, which were basalt and granite. When you go to the Metropolitan Museum in New York, then you see waterstone, which is a permanent feature in the Japanese art galleries. So that's one of the sculptural language that he is best known for. But he has worked in many other materials as well, such as terracotta. You can see that it goes all the way back to even the 1930s. The example called Portrait of My Uncle, when he was still working in or trying to decide which figurative or abstract language he was going to work in. You can still see that there's very much sort of naturalistic language still at play then. But then a couple of decades later, in the early 1950s, then you can see that his language begins to change pretty dramatically, even though the material is the same. All three are in the collection of MoMA. But he also worked in metal as well. As early as 1928, this work called Lida, working with bronze and brass. By the late 1950s, he started working with other metals like aluminum, which was quite controversial in the New York art world, also with his own dealers. So there's a complicated story about what was more desirable as material, what kind of language was more desirable. But he also worked with perhaps less privileged materials like galvanized steel, very cheap but robust materials that he used in his late years in the 1980s to create a whole series of edition sculptures, which I will also talk about a little bit later. But I don't think I should really presume that all of you come with baseline knowledge of who Noguchi is. So perhaps I will give you a little introduction on his biography, starting from top left. So Noguchi is in Japan in 1908 at the age of 5. Noguchi was born in 1904 in Los Angeles. His mother was a Scottish American named Leonie Gilmore. She was a writer, educator, and editor. And his father was named Yone Noguchi, who was a poet, was in the US and met Noguchi's mother because they were working on translation of his poetry. And they fell in love and produced little Isamu. They never got married. And that was the beginning of a very complicated relationship that Isamu had with his father. Now you see, after spending the formative years in Japan, he was sent at the middle school age back to the U.S. First ended up in the Midwest, and then soon ended up in New York. And you see Isamu Noguchi as a young 18, 19-year-old budding sculptor there in 1923, working very much in that very sort of classical Beaux-Arts style. In 1927, he has an opportunity to go to Paris and spend several months in the studio of Constantin Brancusi. So the photo that you see there, almost like very sort of classical profile view of young Noguchi with curly hair in 1928 was you can actually see because there are examples of Brancusi's works there as well. Now, after spending some years in Europe between France and the UK, he makes his way back to Asia via Trans-Siberian Railway and ends up in Beijing in circa 1930, 1931, and has a chance to study ink painting, a tradition that he was not familiar with. And then now back in the US in the 1930s. So, of course, this is period after the Great Depression. Soon, of course, the early years of World War II and whatnot, and you can see how his figurative language also has changed greatly, also under the influence of figures like Diego Rivera and other Mexican muralists, which you see expressed in this still existing wall relief over the entrance of the Rockefeller Center in the Midtown, New York. Noguchi was also something of a super connector. He was very much embedded in that very concentrated group of avant-garde figures, not just artists, but also dancers, architects, and thinkers. So I already mentioned these are very important dramatist personae, basically, in Noguchi's life. So I already talked about Brancusi, and I don't think he needs any further introduction. But in terms of the 20th century modern sculptural history, Noguchi's direct predecessor is Brancusi, really. I also mentioned that he spent some months in circa 1930, 1931 in Beijing, and he studied under Qi Baishu, very important modern ink painters, one of the, always sort of mentioned as the father of the ink paint, bringing really modernizing ink painting into the 20th century. Martha Graham, of course, revolutionary dancer that he worked very closely with as a set designer and creative collaborator. And Kenzo Tange, of course, one of the most important 20th century Japanese architect. He worked with him several times. Sofu Teshigahara was the founder of the avant-garde Ikebana flower arrangement school called the Sogetsu, which was also a kind of an epicenter of other avant-garde activities, whether it's in fine art or design. Buckminster Fuller, of course, the revolutionary thinker in the space of architecture and science in the mid-20th century United States. Louis Kahn, another very important architect that the Noguchi had a very important relationship with. Rou Sanjin is a potter, an avant-garde potter that he also was quite close with. Now, the final figure that I will mention is Yoshiko Yamaguchi, who was Noguchi. Well, I mean, Noguchi had several loves, but Yamaguchi was the only woman that he actually married. But fascinating figure, Japanese, but was born in Manchuria during the time that Japan was occupying northern part of Japan. Started her career as an actress in Chinese language films, some of them also propaganda films of Japanese Empire. returned to Japan, was something of a Hollywood star for a short period. And she was in a movie with Marlon Brando. And then later in her career became quite an influential politician as well. So somebody who had an incredible life trajectory and had an intersection with Noguchi in the early to mid 1950s. So I think you sort of get a sense of what sort of colorful life he had from the very beginning of his origin. He embodied transcultural, transnational ethos was really very much in his DNA. So I'm showing you images on the left of a view of Noguchi Museum, which was originally called Noguchi Garden Museum in Long Island City in Queens in New York. And below it is his garden museum in Murei in Shikoku Island in Japan. So Noguchi was one of the first artists to have a monographic museum, but he didn't have one, he had two actually. And he also he himself was very much part of creating these monographic museums. He also has these permanent gardens. The one on top is called the Moerenuma Park outside of Sapporo, and the one below is the UNESCO garden in Paris. So these are just two examples of permanent gardens or landscaped features that he has created. So I think there are very few artists who can say that they have two monographic museums and permanent garden features around the world. So that really shows you the the importance of the concept of the garden in his own way, as well as his footprint, if you will, that is global. So it's somewhat well known. I mean, I wouldn't assume that you all are familiar with it necessarily, but those who have studied Noguchi a little bit know that one of the really life-changing events that he had took place around 1942. So Noguchi voluntarily entered the internment camp for Japanese Americans that was set up, in the early years of World War II. So this is called Executive Order 9066, which was signed by Franklin Roosevelt, the president then. And this was executive order that ordered the Japanese Americans, regardless of what generations you are, in the first generation, second generation, third generations, you could be only part Japanese ethnically. But if you're living in the Western states of the United States, then you were considered enemies of the war. So they were sent off, they were ordered to go into the internment camps where they had to stay until the end of the war. So this is one of the sort of the greatest stains on the conscience of really the United States. So you see an example of the what they call war relocation camps, essentially really internment camps that were set up in really remote areas, like in the desert of Arizona or in Idaho. I think there was another one in Arkansas. Now, because Noguchi was, even though he was born in Los Angeles, for a long time he was based in New York City. So he wasn't subject to this executive order, but he decided to voluntarily enter the camp with the desire of really hoping to improve these harsh living conditions for the Japanese Americans. But also, I think he had an idealistic view of what he could do to shape and sculpt the landscape of the desert of Arizona. He was actually encouraged by somebody named John Collier, who was then the commissioner of what was called Indian Affairs. And he suggested that, Noguchi might be able to help plan landscape development of the camp. And that was part of the reason for him entering voluntarily. Now, to fast forward, he ended up staying only for about 7 months and ended up leaving full of disappointment and frustration because many of the plans as he was developing didn't come to fruition. So these are the works that he made immediately after coming out of the voluntary internment and departure. from the camp. The one titled This Tortured Earth, I mean, the title as well as the form itself clearly indicates the kind of anguish and frustration that he clearly experienced during the time that he spent in the camp in Arizona. So here's a quote of from Noguchi, how he talked about that work, This Tortured Earth. He says, the idea of sculpting the earth followed me through the years, with mostly playground models as metaphor, but then there were others. This tortured earth was my concept for a large area to memorialize the tragedy of war. This is injury to the earth itself. The war machine, I thought, would be excellent equipment for sculpture to bomb it into existence. Quite an ambiguous description. And the next work is called My Arizona. Obviously, there is a certain affinity between the two sculptures, but you can also see the departures from of the slightly later sculpture from the first one, with the incorporation of this at the time unusual material such as plastic, right? Yeah, but title My Arizona clearly indicates that this is about his experience in the internment camp. Now, soon returning back to New York City, then he finds a small studio on a little street called McDougal Alley, which is just north of Washington Square Park in lower part of Manhattan. And here's an archive of photo that shows you what his studio looked like. And what is evident in this archive of photo is the pretty wide range of sculptural forms and experiments he was doing at the time. Yeah, and and then also an emergence of new technique and a body of work. And then what I mean is that these are sculptures that are more in the foreground, the sculptures that are made out of interlocking stone pieces that are put together and stand up without welding or using fasteners like nails or screws. Now, this was a very important breakthrough for Noguchi. So, figure from 1945 is the first finished example in this new direction in sculpture that he was doing. And you can see Noguchi standing there with the cut marble pieces at the time, and then with all these slots that are uh, in the pieces, and they join together perfectly like joinery, really. That's what it is. But of course, not made out of wood in this case, but made out of thin slabs of marble or slate to stand up and stay standing, really. And this was the time also that Noguchi was finally beginning to receive critical acclaim. It was the year, I think, year after, actually 1946, that he had his first major museum solo exhibition at the Whitney Museum, which was then just around the corner. Anyway, so then he continues to develop over the next few years in this series. So you can see examples from this body of interlocking sculptures that he furiously started producing from Gregory Effigy, Kuros, Humpty Dumpty, Avatar. Now, what you see here is that these are his own reinterpretation of what anthropomorphic or figurative forms could be, right? And then all the titles suggest that. Kuros, of course, the Greek statue, male statue, Humpty Dumpty from Alice in Wonderland, Avatar. But also what these forms, as well as the title suggests, is that they are not stable forms, right? As they are figures of metamorphosis. And the title of Gregory Effigy comes from, of course, the famous Kafka's novella called The Metamorphosis, whose main character is named Gregor Samsa, who wakes up on one morning, and realizes that he has turned into a cockroach, right? So this idea of metamorphosis is very deeply embedded in this whole series of works. And I think I'd like to venture that this series of sculptures was really an expression of that experience of frustration and dejection that he had during the war years, but also how somebody who was born and grew up with such a complicated cultural identity when it was also deeply vilified, his Japanese side, that the experience of the self and his identity being disassembled and being reassembled together. So I really feel that in many ways, this body of work is his self-portraiture, especially when you see one of the early examples called Strange Bird from 1945. And then there's many of these pieces actually have this, the planning worksheets, which are still very much preserved in museum collections as well as Noguchi Museum Archive. And you can see how he, in that very analog way, planned these different pieces. So Strange Bird comes with the three large pieces that together become limbs and the torso, and they really have to balance together to stand up. And then there's these two pieces that are sort of, you can think of it as a torso or shoulder blades, that are put on to complete the sculpture. And that archival photo that he took of the original version of Strange Bird, made out of green marble, and Noguchi standing in front of it, really gives you a very close good sense of the scale. I mean, it's really the humans or Noguchi scale. Noguchi was pretty diminutive, and then how it really is in many ways his own avatar is how I think this particular sculpture is. And we are very lucky to have one of the variations that he created some years later, made out of bronze. Okay, so thus far I haven't really talked much about Noguchi's interest in or critical importance of garden or landscape architecture in his work and thought, but I think it is important to really understand his biography and then its intersection with his sculptural language, especially in the early years. Now, I'm showing you again the detail of his McDougall Alley studio on the top left. And what you see there is, I think I can use this, that work called My Arizona from 1943 that I was talking about earlier. But you also see sculptures on the floor, hanging on the wall, but sometimes even suspended. So he was really thinking about, of course, the whole range of sculpture possibilities. And then leaning against the wall is this work, which was a model for what was called contoured playground in 1941. So what we're talking about here is just before Executive Order 9066, just before Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, which precipitated Executive Order 9066. And this was something that he was working on because he was invited by, at the time, somebody named Robert Moses, and some of you may know that, like, notorious, what would you call it? Sort of like he was kind of a kingpin of New York City, who really dictated the whole urban development of the city, right? So he was invited by Robert Moses to propose a playground for Central Park, that with elements that would not cause any injury. So this sort of idea of safety for playing children. I mean, this is actually quite ahead of its time. So it went quite far of planning this, but then of course a war broke out, and then the plan was not realized. But this is sort of indication of the importance of playground in Noguchi's concept of garden, which I will come back to. But also another very striking work that he made in 1947 is this work. And this only exists as an archival photograph now. It was made out of originally packed sand. And this work called Sculpture to be Seen from Mars. So you know that this is not just a normal scale sculpture. It's an earthwork that he was proposing to make. And then this is, mind you, at least 2-3 decades before earthworks became a real thing, right? This land art and earthworks still have to wait until they get realized. So this has also a different title. Originally, it was called The Monument to Man. And this is in the wake of course, how World War II ended, which is the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So not just because of his part Japanese identity, but this was really signal for the whole humanity that it is perhaps we're heading towards the inevitable self-destruction. So if that's the fate of humanity, then what is the final sculpture that we might leave for the aliens to learn that there was a civilization on Earth? So here is the radically simplified human face. And then the nose bridge that you see was meant to be 1 mile long so that you for sure will be able to see this from outer space. Mm. Okay, so maybe let's talk about gardens a little bit. So after a very turbulent period of the 1940s that he experienced in the United States, then he finally make his way back to Japan in the early 1950s. One thing that I forgot to mention when I was walking through his biography very quickly was that when he was in Beijing, coming back from Europe around 1930, 1931, his next destination was Japan. So he went back to Japan for the first time since he left as a young teenager, with the intention of reconnecting with his father, who, I forget if I mentioned, but his father and his mother never married. And then the father married a Japanese woman. And when he went back to Japan, basically the father refused to acknowledge him. So that was a very traumatic experience that he had in the early 1930s. So it took another 20 years or so for him to return. So this was quite, I think, a cathartic moment or a period of resolution in his mind. So this project that he did, working very closely with two very important post-war creative figures in Japan, Kenzo Tange that I already mentioned, excuse me, this is not a Kenzo Tange, another very important architect, Yoshiro Taniguchi, who's the father also of another preeminent architect, Yoshio Taniguchi, and the industrial and furniture designer named Isamu Kenmochi. So three of them got together to create this sort of kind of lounge for the faculty for Keio University, one of the elite universities in Tokyo, which is where Noguchi's father, Yone Noguchi, taught literature for 40 years. So this beautiful lounge and the garden outside, including Noguchi designed the sculpture out there, was created in honor of Yone Noguchi. So very, very important project that he got to realize. But that's not to say that he's returned to Japan now as a mature, successful artist in his now 40s, going to early 50s, was all successful. So another invitation that he got is to propose this memorial for the dead of Hiroshima. So this invitation came through Kenzo Tange, who was responsible for creating a whole master plan for the area in the center of the city of Hiroshima that was completely devastated, but was being turned into a memorial park. Now, so Noguchi designed this, and the intention here is to create a very striking two-part structures. And the above ground, what you see there is a massive, meant to be massive, arching structure made out of heavy black granite, which is meant to suggest the sky I mean, obviously it also symbolizes explosion, but also it's a kind of double-edged symbolism of destruction and rebirth that he intended. Below ground was meant to be a dark subterranean crypt that was accessible through the staircase and housing a symbolic receptacle to hold the names of all the victims, more than 100,000 people who died by the explosion. Now, this striking design had the backing of Tange and many others in the cultural field, but in the end was rejected because even though, despite his partly Japanese identity, the fact that he's American, and then Americans are the ones responsible for the atomic bombings, just was not politically and socially acceptable. So another example of that, the internal conflict or contradiction. Now, but from then, he gets one of his most important commissions, and that was to create a garden for the UNESCO headquarters that was being built in Paris, and this was being done by Marcel Breuer's office. And then there was the commissioning art program that was put together, which included other, August figures like Picasso, Matisse, Miro, Alexander Calder, Henry Moore. So Noguchi was a sort of the young gun who was included in this masters, Western masters, and he was originally given just this area, just the patio area, just outside of the building. And one thing that Noguchi turned out to be was that he was a very savvy politician as well as a businessman, and he managed to convince the architect and the commissioner that this part needs to be something like a Japanese garden. And to make a long story short, so he managed to get that huge lot as well. But what that also meant was that he himself also had to do a lot of groundwork to fundraise, because there was no budget for this originally. So he had to write to the Japanese ministry, foreign ministry, and start basically a fundraising campaign to be able to create this garden. In the end, what he tried to do, even though, of course, rhetorically, he said that, like we need, and well, I mean, UNESCO also felt that there needs to be an Asian contribution, which is why, of course, Noguchi was one of the reasons why he was selected, but he also knew how to use it politically. And then in the end, his intention wasn't to create an authentic Japanese garden. He actually called the final result somewhat Japanese garden. And what he did is going back to the very first photo that I showed you of Noguchi with Shigemori standing in a rock field of stones and examining. And in the end, they selected, I think, something like a 50 stones. 80 tons of stones were transposed from Japan to this garden. Now, I think so what you see here are, of course, is still, I'm sorry that it's a very low resolution photo, but there's, of course, elements of water and the grass and gravel and in the sort of stones. And he also worked closely with master landscape designers or gardeners from Japan, from Kyoto. And it was not a smooth relationship at all. I think he actually went through 3 master gardeners because, of course, they wanted to create something very classical, like the kinds of gardens that you would see in Kyoto, but that wasn't really Noguchi's intention. But what you see in the end is the realization of that philosophy that was quoted in the title of this talk and the description. So this is what how Noguchi described it. So as you walk through this somewhat Japanese garden, the vista constantly changes, and everything being relative, things suddenly loom up in scale as others diminish. The real purpose of the garden may be the contemplation of the relative in space, time, and life. So this is the first time that he felt that he fully realized his understanding of what garden or landscape architecture is, the relative in space, time, and life. Um, Oh, I guess one other thing that I should mention is that this experience of also finding the 80 tons of stone, so maybe it's not surprising at all, just made him realize that the rest of his career, stone is just something, the material that he will return to again and again. So showing you just a few other examples, that less that you think that the Noguchi's gardens are all somewhat Japanese and includes natural elements. One of the people in the 1960s that he worked very closely with is architect Gordon Bunshaft, who was one of the partners of the Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill, like one of the largest, of course, firms that built some of the largest modernist buildings and urban projects in the US. So Bunshaft, even though they had quite a sort of touchy relationship, returned to Noguchi again and again to create gardens that are embedded inside the building. So when Bunshaft was working on this building called the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University, he invited Noguchi to create a sunken garden that is embedded in the middle of the library. So what you see here are three forms, which is a ring and a pyramid and a cube, with these lines that suggest in what I mean, how Noguchi talked about it is that this is non-Euclidean, even though they may appear very Euclidean geometry. And in fact, he was trying to combine something that might come from a Renaissance drawing with his Zen, what he learned from Zen garden. So these forms at first may look very Euclidean, but in fact that they are all a little bit wonky, if you will. So the ring is not perfectly a ring, and pyramid, all sides are not exactly the equal. And the cube, of course, is balancing on one little point. And in Noguchi's description, all these lines are also the kinds of lines that you may see in Zen sand garden. Yeah, so again, sort of kind of bringing all these different cultural references and understandings together. So another famous sunken garden that he made was Chase Manhattan Bank Plaza in the lower Manhattan as well, another Gordon Bunshaft project. And here I think he tries something that is somewhere in between, right? Because there's the water element that's there. And that these rocks, unlike the Beinecke example, rocks again that have been found in Japan, specifically in Kyoto, in Kamogawa River, and the Uji River that's just outside of Kyoto that I brought over here. And these lines that are created by the tiles, which Noguchi talked about as both being inspired by the very stylized patterned forms of clouds in Chinese paintings, but also again the lines that are created by the Zen monks, as they scrape along the sand gardens, as you might see in, say, Ginkakuji, the famous Temple of Silver Pavilion in Kyoto. He actually called this my Ryoanji. So this is, of course, Noguchi's own version of his own Ryoanji. Now, like another thing that he said, and this is a quote about this particular example, is that I'm thinking of calling this example, this he actually called this sculpture, exploding universe. We live in, so he didn't call it a garden, he called it a sculpture, yeah? And we live in an expanding universe. We're going to the moon, and I've built a moonscape. Another thing that he said about this particular garden is sculpture has been taken off the pedestal, the most artificial restriction ever invented for it. So now, if we think back to his one of the first transformative artistic experience was the apprenticeship that he had in the studio of Brancusi. Of course, Brancusi is the early modernist sculptor who turned pedestals into part of the artworks, right? So what the next step is that you get rid of the pedestals altogether, which is also something the generation of artists in New York City that are coming up immediately was beginning to do. The minimalist sculptors, are about to do this, but Noguchi is about a generation or two ahead of them. So how he expressed all of those ideas that are very much in the moment or ahead of its time in avant-garde art, but through the spatial understanding of garden. So there's sort of kind of sort of slippage between sculpture and garden is really key in understanding Noguchi and his relationship with landscape architecture. Earlier, I said that I was going to come back to playground. More specifically, he called it Playscape. So we looked at the 1941 example of contoured playground meant for Central Park originally, but he's interested in playground scape go back into the 1930s. So here's an example of what he planned for Hawaii. This project that he was going to do, Riverside Drive Playground, which he worked together with Louis Kahn, also finally unrealized. For one for United Nations Playground, and even his proposal for the U.S. Pavilion for World Expo 1970 in Osaka, looking more like a playground as well. So none of them got to be realized, but he kept trying. So here is the example of the 1939 Playscape that he was planning for Hawaii. So really rethinking what swings can look like, what slide can look like, what jungle gym can look like. So you can see 1940, he's already, very much a mature artist at this point, but this element was very integral in his practice. And it went all the way to the end of his career. So Noguchi passed away in 1988. And just a couple of years before he was selected to represent the United States at the Venice Biennale. And then what does it put right in front of the US Pavilion is a slide called Slide Mantra. And finally, towards the end of his life, and actually at the very end of his life, he got to realize the grandest landscape project, which is a gigantic playground essentially. And this is called Moerenuma Park, just outside of Sapporo in Hokkaido, the northern island. And so he submitted this project model. What you see is the actual aerial view of the finished project. So project proposal was submitted just before his passing, and his very close collaborator named Shoji Sadao realized it over the course of almost 20 years that followed. So this was a gigantic, basically garbage dump that was created when the city of Sapporo created underground subways. So the city invited different proposals, and the Noguchi's proposal of this gigantic earthworks were selected in the end. These are some of the elements of the play sculpture. So it really harks back to the very early models from the late 1930s that he finally developed. Some of them prefabricated elements, and some of them built on site. And this was one time when I got to visit in the deep winter, is what it looks like. But it really kind of gives you a sense of the sculpting of the earth that he got to do finally here. And that's not just a snow mountain, that is actually an earth mountain covered in snow. Yeah, so to bring it all back home, if you will, so what does all of this mean for an institution, specifically the institution that I work for called M+. So the museum opened in November 2021 in the middle of the COVID lockdown of the whole city of Hong Kong. But there was almost a decade of preparation that we did before the museum opened. And part of that preparation is to build a permanent collection. And Noguchi was identified as one of what we call anchor artists. And as Shahari mentioned during the introduction, that my job is to help look over our 3 disciplinary areas. So we're not just a contemporary art museum, but we are also a museum of contemporary design and architecture and moving image. So somebody who crosses across disciplines, right? Noguchi, but also it's not just disciplines, also he's a trans-cultural figure and a trans-generational figure as well. So you see the examples of his, what might fall under the category of industrial design or furniture design on the top left. Already in the 1930s, he was designing, this household electronic item, radio, nurse, and guardian, basically baby monitors, right? And then he also designed furniture, water table dining suite. In the 1950s, when he was spending a lot of time again in Japan, and then he sort of revived this traditional craft of a paper lantern making by turning them into illuminated sculptures, which are called akari, which just means illumination or light. So we have a number of the sort of vintage examples from the early years from late 50s, early 60s. That very important stop that he made in Beijing in 1930. He made a number of ink paintings, and we're very lucky to have one of the rare examples of it. So we've been successively building our collection across different periods of his life and different modes in his practice. And one very major um, acquisition that we made at the same time as that 1945 sculpture called Strange Bird that I already talked about is this group of galvanized steel sculptures, which is a set of 26. Um, Single material, again, very cheap, humble, but very robust material that is used for usually industrial purposes. Um, and it's a really uh, something like a grammar book of how sculpture can be made, through cutting and joining. That you can make all kinds of sculptures. And, there's one of them, this one over here, which I showed before, is titled Atomic Haystack. And this one over here is called Zazen, which, of course, the Zen term for meditation sitting. So it's literally almost like A to Z of what a sculpture can be, an incredible body of work. So while we were still preparing for the opening of the museum, we were also envisioning how this very broad body of work of Noguchi could really express what the institution's identity is. We haven't done this. This is just a render. Still waiting for one of those days that I can take over some of our beautiful galleries to install the whole set of our galvanized steel sculptures. But anyway, another very critical way that the Noguchi really manifested himself in the middle of the institution. So again, not assuming that you know much about M Plus or our context, I'm showing you this area of picture of West Kowloon Cultural District, also known as West K, which is that the whole Hong Kong government initiated project of building a cultural district in the heart of the city on Victoria Harbour that M Plus is part of. So you see M Plus standing right over here. But again, as I mentioned before, the museum opened in 2021 while we were under construction. Just next door, like right over here, where you can see my cursor, was this tiny little pavilion that was about 400 square meters that we used for about 4 years to make exhibitions, to really tell our public what the museum is about. But also we thought of this as a kind of a little training ground for us curators and exhibition production team about what does it mean to make exhibition, because this is 400 square meters. And we knew that we were moving into a building with 18,000 square meters of gallery spaces. So we needed a lot of practice, which we did. And one of the exhibitions that we made was called Noguchi for Yambo Counterpoint in 2018. So Yambo is a Vietnamese-born artist who grew up in Denmark, internationally prominent artist, somebody who really looks at objects and biographies and colonial histories as really his material, as his ready-made. And one of the lodestar figures in his practice was Noguchi. And even though the artist himself really described, never liked that, I really thought of them as spiritual coevals, right? Even though there's like 2 or 3 generations in between them, somebody with the cultural conflict that is deeply embedded in their DNA. So this was a project that we made with the Noguchi Museum and Foundation. So Dakin Hart, that we mentioned before, the former senior curator at the Noguchi Museum, worked very closely with us to lend works from their museum collection. So this was the first time that we were able to borrow any works from other museums, because we didn't have a museum. We just had a museum under construction next door. So this was a very important turning point for us. Now, why do I mention that? Because that was a way that we could start a relationship and be ready for creating this garden or playscape of our own, a permanent feature for the museum. So yeah, so this is M Plus building, by the way, in case you didn't know what you were looking at. This is the museum building designed by Herzog and de Meuron. And then it's part of a campus where we have the second building, which is our collection storage facility and conservation studio and office tower for the central district that I was talking about. So the whole project involved really, I have to really make a little detour to one of the sort of final garden projects that he made called California Scenario. So again, Noguchi died in 1988, so this was one of the final projects that he oversaw. I mentioned that Noguchi was born in Los Angeles, even though he didn't really spend that much time, but he always felt that he wanted to do something in the state of his birth. And he was given this commission by a businessman who was building an office and shopping complex, basically. And then this little lot that was couched in between these different buildings is what was offered to Noguchi. And then what he created is his own interpretation of what California is, you know, where, I mean, of course, it is a land of abundance, but also a land with a perpetual water problem. At the same time, it's a place of great natural contrast from deserts to high mountains, snow-peak mountains. And then also this particular land was formerly a big agricultural land because, of course, California is one of the big agricultural producers. But the reason why I wanted to show you this is this particular feature of bench that's in the foreground. And then showing you a couple of other views of the forms that he created for that garden called California Scenario. You see that sort of kind of wonky pyramidal form appearing again from the Beinecke library from the early 1960s. And this is the bench that he designed for that. At the same time, I'm showing you one of his prefabricated clay sculptures that he got to realize already in the 1960s. The one that was the most successful and have been realized, and he was able to distribute in many different parts of the world. So these were some of the elements that we took to build our own garden. So this is our north terrace from the building image. I think you were just quickly go back to say that we have a south terrace which faces Victoria Harbor, and the north terrace which is couched in the our tower as well as the two adjacent towers. So these were some of the renders that we were making. So there were three main areas that was already created. I mean, this was a part of Herzog and de Meuron's architectural design and the landscape architect that they worked very closely with to already create the garden planning as well as the paved areas. Now, it was our decision to decide what do we do with this? And then what we decided is to create the playscape based on Noguchi. So here are the different octetras and different combinations of ones and twos and fours strewn throughout. And here are the granite benches that I was just showing you from California Scenario. And the two elements called the play pyramid and play mount needed to be created on site. So of course, based on Noguchi's designs that are found in the archive at the Noguchi Museum, but these two elements do not exist anywhere in the world. So these are some of the other renders that we created. Yeah, just giving you an overview of what that looked like during the planning process, then finally realized about 6 months after the museum opening in April 22, when the city was still closed. So Dakin from the Noguchi Museum that we worked very closely with, not just from that exhibition that I previously mentioned, but this whole project was not able to actually physically come at all because Hong Kong was essentially closed to the rest of the world. And then sort of finally showing you what the realization look like. There's me looking very happy with the mask still on, um, and how the play pyramid looks. And then what was also very important for planning this particular pyramid, which was realized only once in Japan, in Yokohama, for a kids' water park in the 60s. And then this was demolished and it doesn't exist anymore. So we had to follow the plan and create our own version. You might have noticed that in the when I showed you the render of our building, then it's a very square building, right? Almost perfectly square podium pointing almost perfect cardinal directions of north, south, east, west. So obviously the pyramid is another very square form, and what we decided to do in the original render was exactly orthogonal to the building and the tower. But in the end, what we decided to do is to tilt it by about 20 degrees so the central axis aligns with where the sun rises in the summer equinox and where the sun sets in the winter, no, sorry, summer solstice and the winter solstice. And that this wasn't just our curatorial sleight of hand, but Noguchi himself was very much interested in astronomy and cosmos, and sort of kind of think back to that quote that I had that he created his own moonscape. During his world tour that brought him to Sri Lanka, he also stopped in India and went to see Jantar Mantars, so he was very much interested in astronomy. And that also informed his landscape feature as well. Now, one of the reasons why Noguchi was so interested in Playscape was because he really thought of this as a play sculptures, playscapes as a way that it's not just for children, but for people of any age to be creative through physical activities and play. Now, I think it is so telling in what 21st century what play means. So our play pyramid turned out to be the most popular wedding photo spot in Hong Kong. I think every day we get about 6 different teams um, perch themselves on top. And then we also get graduation photos. We have like primary, secondary, and university students come and take photos there. And then one day I spotted this Superman landing from my office, and then clear, of course, accompanied by a photographer. So yes, I mean, I think the idea of play has changed from Noguchi's time, but that's not to say that it's irrelevant. So I think our own garden, our own M plus Playscape by Noguchi also makes you question and reflect on exactly what Noguchi was also mentioning, reminding us, right? That garden is a place to contemplate the relative in space, time, and life. So I will end there. Thank you for your attention. And
Thank you so much, Dorian. That was such a lovely introduction to Noguchi, but also you unpacked with so much depth and nuance the complexity of his work. And I think for many of us, he is really a lodestar. Um, I think one of the things in this On Gardens project that we've been grappling with is the way that gardens can be so local, so site based, and then they can really in many of the photos that you showed, I think the same with Brûlé Marx, you see them from above and they have this connection to the heavens, to beyond the planet really. And I think I found it really interesting what you were saying about citing this particular work, and I'm curious um, on a broader scale with some of his other works, the way the local or the specific site or position impacted Noguchi's work, or maybe it didn't. But I would love to hear a little bit more about that, and then so that we can get everybody home before it starts raining again, we'll open straight into questions. So after that, we'll take questions from all of you.
I mean, I think Noguchi, like I mean, of course, he died before, I was had a chance to meet him, and then ask professional questions. But what I gather by reading about him is that he definitely had a very contradictory aspects to his character, right? So I think I kind of talked about very idealistic side, somebody who would intern himself, with that idealism of really trying to help Japanese Americans that he felt empathy with, but also sculpt the earth. Um, at another point that I said that, but he was also a very good businessman and politician as well. So I think idealism and pragmatism, I think, coexist within him, and I think that's also is mirrored in his sensitivity to individual local context, that he certainly could read what was needed in every single context he was given to, whether it's embedded inside a modernist building, or whether it's something like the California scenario, which is far from ideal situation. But at the same time, he's able to tackle local specificities, but he also imposes his own idealistic vision, which is ultimately about what sculpture can be, um, no matter what. So, like, he will impose a universal principle and desire.
Thanks so much, Dorian. That was fascinating. I had two questions. One, I was actually just curious what made you select the galvanized steel sculptures for the collection,
Yeah,
just in terms of strategy and how
yeah,
these somehow also contrast with the playscape. So it
yeah,
would be great to know the direction
yeah.
for this. And I was really drawn to this tortured earth as a work,
Mm,
and it would be really, I think, quite interesting to speak more to that, because
yeah,
he clearly also imagined this as a kind of earthwork, right? And like I just came across this quote. Sorry to be slightly distracted, but I wanted to go deeper in terms of this work, and I just came across this quote where he says, imagines this as injury to the earth itself. And
yeah.
he says, the war machine, I thought, would be excellent equipment for sculpture to bomb it into existence. And I think
Yes.
that's like so profound also for the times that we are living through now.
Yeah. I mean, maybe I'll address that first as best as I can. I mean, I think I was kind of suggesting after reading that quote that it's quite sort of ambiguous in that sense, right? I mean, to say the war machine can be a great sculptor. I mean, like that is, and also if you think about that in relation to the 1947 proposal for sculpture, which is sculpture to be seen from Mars, like it's almost the two sides of the same coin in a sense, right? Like this kind of a almost in a very macho kind of way, that in kind of channeling exactly what produces wars, right? I mean, it is that the machismo, but then at the same time being weirdly pessimistic as well as kind of utopian in the sense that we may bomb ourselves out of existence, but we may build a sculpture that we will be remembered by. So I think that there is that. I don't know how strategic it was or how intentional it was, but you begin to see that, um, yeah, strange ambivalence or ambiguity in many of the things that he says. Um, Again, to imagine, and that is a kind of common, you know, um, illness, if you will, amongst all of the earthwork and land artists, which is megalomania, right? Like without having that, you won't be a land artist. And he was in many ways a predecessor to all of them, the famous figures like Robert Smith and Michael Heiser and all of those. Um, so I think that he had his own megalomania, but then I think perhaps he was I mean, this is just maybe very bad pop psychology, but because he was in many ways the odd man out amongst the people that he was surrounded by, right? I mean, he was probably one of the very few non-white artists or mixed race artists who was successful, but also faced many prejudices as well. So, maybe that contradictory nature also, again, kind of comes from that biographical experience. Going to the first question, which is really a question about institution building, that, yeah, I mean, we discussed like what are some of the most representative works by Noguchi that we can have. I mean, easy answer is one of those massive stone sculptures. I mean, in the end, that's what he's best known for widely. But it was also sort of kind of looking at how much, like what's in your pocketbook, but also thinking about, as a 21st century institution that is opening, a new kind of a vision, do we also adhere to what is already verified as the great modernist masterpieces, right? What are the other ways in which that we can argue the Noguchi's continued relevance? So really looking at him as an industrial designer, as a furniture designer, somebody who brought back the traditional craft like Japanese paper lantern making, but then calling that sculptures because he thought of them as sculptures. He didn't think of them as household objects, really. And then, but of course, we needed to have more fine artworks. So Strange Bird was an interesting example because, at least, this curator really felt that that body of work that he created from 1945 to 1948 is just so critical, the interlocking sculptures, right? But the original marble or slate sculptures are extremely rare. They're not available. They're all gone, or actually many of them didn't survive because they're fragile. So he started casting them in bronze or other aluminum, and then but he really thought of them as not just editions of lost originals or existing originals, but them as variations. And then so the patina is all different, the colors are different, and that advances the idea of the singular modernist masterpiece in a more interesting way. And then I think what he did with the galvanized steel sculptures is going even one step further. That, as I said, it's a one single material, 26 different kinds of forms, from something that is this small to something that is 2.5 meters tall. A form that is anthropomorphic, something that is very domestic, something that is very landscape-like, but also edition sculptures. So each one is an edition of 18, but in his lifetime, he never got to finish all of them. So this was actually a sculpture that was meant to be more affordable, maybe not for everybody, but for some people in institutions mostly. But then no institution that I know of, well, actually, it was confirmed by the Noguchi Museum at the time that no institution had a whole set of them. And in my mind, again, it's literally from A to Z. And like the fact that there are 26 of them, and I couldn't find the proof that he was really thinking about the 26 letters of the alphabet, but it's almost like he meant, and it's not really A, B, C, D to Z, but almost. So that really talks about the essence of sculpture making in my mind, rather than having one gigantic basalt sculpture. So it became an institutional decision in that sense.